Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees Mogg about the topics of the day.
Well, hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Moggcast. I'm Mark Wallace, the Executive Editor of Conservative Home, hosting this week's episode. I am, of course, joined by the man himself, Jacob Rees Mogg. Hello, Jacob.
Hello, Mark. Thank you for coming in.
We meet on a day when you have had your article in the Telegraph this morning in the run-up to the, we're told, crunch final decision Chequers meeting later in this week. What reaction have you had to the article going out this morning?
Well, the article is a very straightforward article backing the avowed position of the Prime Minister, who made it clear in her Lancaster House speech, her other speeches, and perhaps most important in the Conservative Party manifesto, that we would leave the single market and the customs union. But unfortunately, there's been a lot of talk from some members of the Cabinet that they want to do things that would undermine this. So what I've been trying to do is to support the Prime Minister's position and to remind people that any implementation deal will have to get through Parliament. And if it's a bad deal or it doesn't meet the manifesto commitments, people won't vote for it. And so it's a reflection of both the strength of the Prime Minister's position and the reality of what would happen if the Cabinet went away from the Prime Minister's avowed position. And you ask the response is exactly what you would expect. A number of pro-Europeans don't like the tone of my article, and a number of Eurosceptics are very keen on the tone of my article.
And implicit to that message that you're out to support the Prime Minister in sticking to the promises that she made, there is, or obviously as you've just mentioned, the prospect that she might be pushed away from some of those. Is that just coming from the Cabinet, or are you also concerned about, say, Ollie Robbins' influence?
I have no view on Mr. Robbins. I don't know him, and I've taken the view, which is, I think, the right view, that advisers advise and ministers decide, and that I think it is unfair to criticise officials for doing their job, that if what they're doing is not correct, they should be told to do something else by the people who employ them. I am concerned, however, the breakdown of collective responsibility within the Cabinet. In the article, I quoted Melbourne's comment on it's not much matter what we say, but we must all say the same. And I think this is really important, and we have had a number of members of the Cabinet who seem to be trying to undermine the Prime Minister's position. And this is really serious. It is constitutionally unsuitable. It's damaging to the Conservative Party, but most importantly, it weakens us in the negotiations. And so what I'm trying to do is reassure the Prime Minister that she has a great deal of support if she sticks to her guns.
And what happens if she doesn't?
Well, there will be legislation. There will be legislation, the WABE bill as it's known, which is the implementation of the withdrawal agreement. Now, that bill will require votes in Parliament, and we will see whether it can get a majority for what it proposes. So let's take one example. It has been proposed that in return for paying £39 billion to the European Union, the UK will merely get a promise of good faith from the European Union in return. If that were to happen, I would vote against it, and I would expect many other people would vote against something of that kind. And I think it's helpful to the government in its negotiating position for people like me to be clear that there are things we simply will not vote for. And that makes the negotiation stance stronger, because the EU will know that if they want a deal, they will have to agree to things that can get through Parliament.
And in terms of the possible consequences of voting against such a bad deal, as you say, how does that stack up? Do you think it's something in the parliamentary arithmetic would mean that it would therefore be rejected? Or do you think the government might think it holds out some prospects of securing enough support from the Labour benches? Or
support from the Labour benches would be very dangerous territory for the government, because a party that depends on opposition votes to get its business through is not in a strong position in government. That's the Robert Peel comparison. Robert Peel got his policy through, which happened to be a very good and sensible one, to long-term benefit of the country, on the back of Whig votes, when the majority of the Conservative Party voted against him. That is a deeply unfavourable precedent. So I think the government would be ill-advised to depend on Labour votes to push its policy through. And it needs to stick to its manifesto commitments, because there is a contract with the British people. This happens at elections, and that contract needs to be fulfilled. There is a caveat, which is good news for the government, and that is that the Fixed Term Parliament Act has meant that individual votes do not become confidence votes. And that's very reassuring, because I'm looking to support the Prime Minister personally, regardless of whether there are bits of the implementation bill that I don't like. To support her as Prime Minister, to support her as leader, and to support the government, not to vote in such a way as would lead to a general election. And under the constitutional settlement of the Fixed Term Parliament Act, that is now possible, because the government could lose the whole of the withdrawal and implementation bill, hold a vote of no confidence the next day in the terms of the Fixed Term Parliament Act, win it, and remain in office.
And to a certain extent, one might argue that that staves off the immediate risk of a general election. Of course, what it doesn't stave off is the prospect of the downfall of the Prime Minister. So, for example, would you be willing to vote against the deal if it meant the Prime Minister going?
But these are separate issues. There's no reason why the Prime Minister, who has consistently said that no deal is better than a bad deal, would feel under any particular pressure to go in the event of bits of a withdrawal bill or a withdrawal bill, an implementation bill, to make clear it's different from the withdrawal bill that's already through, it's become an act. Bits of that did not pass.
Understood, but I suppose if we were to be in the scenario in which she was putting forward a deal which you and others felt was not in keeping with her previous pledges, with the manifesto and so on, to the extent that you felt it necessary to vote against it, then one might also think that actually she might not speak to those others. If she was to say, if I lose this, then I go, or for that matter, if like Cameron, she was to say, if I lose this, I won't go, but there was a practical risk that defeat meant going, would that still be something you would be willing to?
I think these two things are separate. I think it is perfectly possible to support the leader of the party whilst disagreeing with certain aspects of policy. Now, as it happens, I'm expecting to agree with the policy, because I think the Prime Minister will stick to her guns. The one thing we know about the Prime Minister is she is very determined, she perseveres. Look at the conference speech she gave last year. The Prime Minister carries on, she does what she aims to do. And that's very, very reassuring. I'm really trying to support her against the naysayers, some of whom unfortunately are in the Cabinet.
So that possible, that deals to a certain extent with the question of the threat to the Prime Minister, potentially from this. In terms of that possibility of an election, can we completely rule out that there wouldn't be a risk of an election in the government losing such a vote?
Well, what does the Fixed Term Parliament Act require for a general election? It requires either that 2/3 of members of Parliament, and that's all members of Parliament, not simply ones present on the day, vote in favour of a general election, or that the government loses a vote of confidence and no new government can be found within a fortnight. Now, the former case seems extremely unlikely, because the government would have to bring that motion forward itself. Otherwise, Conservative MPs would vote against it. And you might expect that most Conservative MPs would vote against it anyway. On the vote of no confidence issue, why would a Conservative MP vote against the government in those circumstances? Because it's now separate, it's been separated out from the issue at hand. When John Major was Prime Minister, he could go to Parliament, he could go to the House of Commons and say, if I lose this vote, I view it as a vote of confidence, I will go to the palace and ask for a dissolution. It no longer works like that. It has to follow the specific wording of the Fixed Term Parliament Act, and there has to be no government within a fortnight. Any Conservative MP who voted against that would lose the whip and would be unable to stand for the Conservative Party at an ensuing general election. So it would be a kamikaze mission for Conservatives to vote against the government in no confidence vote.
So this can be seen as potentially one of the upsides in some circumstances, but also one of the constitutional sins of the Fixed Term Parliament Act, as we've discussed before in the Mogcast, in that you run the risk of, to a certain extent, the government being trapped in limbo. If God forbid, the Prime Minister was to break her previous pledges in terms of what her red lines are on Brexit, present an unacceptable deal, it was to be defeated, and she was to choose to stay, then with no prospect of a general election, or no incentive to have a general election on the part of the MPs who need to vote for it, but a government unable to carry the House with its agenda, what then?
It would be part of its agenda, not the whole of its agenda. That the Prime Minister has consistently said that no deal is better than a bad deal, and that must be the right position to take for the negotiations, though I've always personally been in favour of getting a reasonable deal. But your fundamental point is right. The Fixed Term Parliament Act was a fundamental constitutional change, and we are dealing with the consequences of that. Some of those consequences are good, some of them are bad. I didn't support the Fixed Term Parliament Act when it came through. I thought it was a constitutional error, but it is now part of our constitution. And in these circumstances, it's actually quite helpful for the Conservative Party and the nation, because it means we can make our case for a good deal without fearing that that will lead to a Corbyn government.
One of the things you cited earlier was this question of discipline in terms of the Cabinet collective responsibility. Obviously, we've seen some conflict over the question of Brexit. We may yet see more as this week goes on. We've seen outbreaks of some stern discussions, should we say, over questions of departmental spending, questions of tax. People appear to be discussing leadership prospects and so on, to the extent that the chairman of the 1922 committee was moved to write in the Observer yesterday that Conservative MPs expected rather more from those around the cabinet table. There's a bit of a difficulty here, isn't there, in that if the Parliamentary Conservative Party, including yourself, would like more discipline from ministers, but at the same time might potentially find itself in a situation where it feels compelled by principle and manifesto to differ from the government on a Brexit deal. Is it possible to square that circle?
Yes, I think it is, because the Cabinet ought to stick to the promises made in the manifesto. And if the principle of collective responsibility were applying, neither Sir Graham Brady nor I would need to write articles for newspapers. And the fact that there is this breakdown in discipline at the Cabinet level is a really serious problem for the government, that we have ministers taking public views on policy matters where they ought to abide by collective responsibility. And this puts great pressure on the government, and it undermines the negotiating stance because it indicates divisions. And you have various ministers going around the Sunday television programmes firing off with views that basically mean we should stay in the European Union. This is against the Prime Minister's speeches, it's against the position formally of the Cabinet, and it's against the manifesto. And that inevitably leads to a response. It is deeply unhelpful.
And as I say, some of that's about policy, particularly Brexit and customs and trade related. Some of it's about money and departmental agendas, be it the NHS spending or defence spending, to think of a couple of examples. Some of it certainly appears to be about the future of both the Conservative Party and, dare I say it, some of the individuals involved. You mentioned earlier this prospect, this quality of the Prime Minister, that she goes on, she continues. To what extent is this question over the future leadership of the party being made worse by the fact that nobody knows how long she intends to go on for?
Nobody ever knows how long any Prime Minister is going to go on for.
Until Tony Blair, for example, felt compelled to say.
And David Cameron said that he would not last beyond the next election. Both of those seriously undermine the authority of the Prime Minister, and they're not lessons that people would wish to follow, I wouldn't have thought. I think if you look at the Harold Wilson approach, nobody knew who was going to go until he went. Nobody knew that Harold Macmillan was going to go until ill health forced him out. Likewise, Anthony Eden. That Prime Ministers do not, in the normal course of events, advertise their retirement date, because the day they do, it undermines their future authority. And so the Prime Minister is absolutely right to give the indication that she is there, as she said, and I thought put it really very well, as long as people wanted her. And I, for one, still want her to carry on.
I suppose I agree with you about Cameron, for example. I think he made a very peculiar decision to say what he did say in terms of his own future at a time when it seemed completely unnecessary to do so. And actually, I think the journalist he was speaking to at the time was a bit surprised to have got the scoop on that front as well. There's still a lot of head-scratching. Perhaps we'll find out one day in his memoirs exactly what happened. Who knows? But in the case of Blair and Brown, it seemed to be the calculation from Tony Blair, which I think is probably quite hard to argue with, looking back on it, that the more it seemed like he might try to carry on indefinitely, the more it spurred trouble and hostility from his already troublesome and hostile neighbour in Downing Street, Gordon Brown. So Is there? I wonder if there is some concern. I certainly hear some concern from our readers that when people talk about the Prime Minister fighting the next general election, people start to get a bit alarmed about that.
I wonder if we go back to the Tony Blair example, whether Mr. Blair currently thinks that what he did was the right thing to have done, or whether he might not have been tempted simply to fire his Chancellor. Prime Ministers have a good deal of patronage and authority if they wish to use it.
That's true. I suppose it's particularly hard to tell in this context because Tony Blair's capacity for looking back and recognising past errors is perhaps more limited than some other Prime Ministers, one might argue. I mean, one of the aspects of this, of course, is that, as you know, Conservative Home tracks party member readers' opinions on future leadership.
Mm-hmm.
You'll have, I dare say, possibly noticed your own slight slide in the rankings yesterday.
Well, to my mind, is normal services resumed, that I'm a backbench MP and I'm not convinced that I ought to be in the list at all. And we have two fine cabinet ministers leading the pack, and that is business as usual.
So you're relaxed about, or even welcoming of that?
I think both Sajid and Michael are first-class candidates. I have the highest regard for both of them, and I think this is what you would expect, that the Conservative Party in office has always, since Baldwin, when in office, that's a crucial point, elected a former Chancellor, Home Secretary or Foreign Secretary.
Do you think it's possible in this age of smashing pre-existing habits that might change?
I think it's very unlikely because the Sajid has shown so successfully in his relatively brief period of Home Secretary that holding the seals of office means you can get things done, and that gives you an ability to show people what you can really do, and I think that's been so important for him in the post-Easter period. Is there some
kind of magic dust associated with those great officers of state still? People wonder sometimes about their dilution or whether they still match up with the modern age, or do you think they still confer a certain intangible something on those who hold them?
I think we're getting old, and that therefore we think that Willie Whitelaw was this amazing, powerful figure, which indeed he was. But you may not have been even alive when he was Home Secretary.
I think we overlapped.
I was, I suppose, 10 when he became Home Secretary. And I think you do look up to people when you're a child in a different way. They seem much more remote and more powerful figures than ones who are your contemporaries, and I think that's just part of the human condition. And that 10-year-olds now will be looking up to Sajid in exactly the way as I looked up to Willie Whitelaw.
Interesting. And you think that carries over some kind of in terms of how we assess politicians in the public eye? The
great Dr. Johnson complained, and bear in mind he was a friend of Edmund Burke's, that there were no great figures in politics in his day, and it was such a pity that they weren't living through the period of King Charles I's reign when there were these great and noble figures who made such an impression. And if you think back to who was around in politics in Dr. Johnson's day, we now look back on them and view them at least as great figures as those in the reign of Charles I.
I'm reminded, I think I'm right in saying there's a passage of the Venerable Bede where he complains and laments that the English of his day have taken to drinking too much beer during the daytime and are rather dissolute when it comes to drunkenness in public.
I think you can go back throughout human history. I think Cicero says something about the quality of politicians of his day. I mean, I think it is just part of human nature to think the people we're dealing with are not of the stature of those of the past.
And so to drag us back to this question of leadership contests, however hypothetical, today's Daily Express, as you've probably seen, reports that, as it puts it, some Brexit supporters, including one other MP, somebody linked to, I think, UKIP donors as well, have what they call a war chest for Jacob Rees Mogg of £750,000 that they've set aside in preparation to presumably hail you as a conquering hero. Is that something you're aware of?
No, not until the Daily Express got in touch with me yesterday afternoon and said they'd heard this. I'm completely unaware of it. I thought it may be something else to do with fundraising to ensure that Brexit is campaigning effectively, which I am very keen to do. But I am unaware, beyond the stories in the Express, of people raising money for me. I'm supporting the Prime Minister. I want the Prime Minister to carry on, and I want to do what she said she would do. And I don't want to be speculating about who's going to take over as the next leader, beyond the normal gossip and chitter-chatter of Westminster. Otherwise, what would journalists and politicians talk about?
Well, quite. I mean, God forbid people stop talking
Yeah,
about what's
I mean,
happening. Otherwise, Conservative Home, among others, would have a challenge to its business model. Dare I say? So, are you definitely ruling out that you would stand in a contest?
There isn't a contest.
But if there was a contest, would you?
I'm technically eligible to become Pope, which is open to all Catholic males. The College of Cardinals has not elected a non-cardinal since, I think, Urban IV. I am very unlikely to be the next Pope, and I'm very unlikely to be the next Prime Minister for exactly the same reasons. They're technically eligible. It is not the way that history will go.
But were either job to become available, would you consider putting yourself
the papacy
forward?
would be fantastic. I mean, I'd be infallible, which is better than is given to most politicians.
So we're ruled in as a possible contender of the papacy, but I must press, in terms of the other possible contest, is it something that tempts you?
I have one concern, as you will have seen from my article in the Telegraph this morning, and that is Brexit is delivered properly. I'm not personally ambitious.
Certainly. So in the same way,
other than to be Pope, which I think would be
naturally, in the same way as those possible donors, as people reported by the Express to be putting aside money, as you say, could use it, for example, to press for a proper Brexit. Were they to feel that the best way to get a proper Brexit was a Jacob Rees-Mogg leadership, or for that matter, were you to feel that the best way to get a proper Brexit was to do that?
I think we're speculating so wildly that we're going beyond the realms of immediate political reality.
Okay. And in terms of other wild speculation, is the World Cup coming home?
Let's hope so.
Let's hope so.
Let's hope so. It's looking very good. Very clever tactical defeat to the Belgians, so that we get an easier quarter-final round. I think that was very wise, cleverly, subtly done.
Presumably your message to the government is not to take any inspiration about tactical defeats relating to Belgians.
That's a very good point. But no, I mean, I'm not an expert on football, but it would cheer the country up enormously if we were to win.
And a final, rather separate topic, in terms of one part of the country that certainly, I think probably would say it needs a bit of a cheering message at the moment, are those parts of the north of England in particular which have been struck by very serious problems in the railways. And it sometimes seems to go in this way in British politics of late, where one might get some good news on paper, for example, progress on airport expansion and infrastructure, and then find that in practice, things which were supposedly already meant to have in place and doing aren't working how they're meant to. Is there a way we can get better at doing infrastructure and things like transport in the UK?
It's a very good question. I mean, I think if you go back to the original rail privatisation, it wasn't done properly, that the track and the operators should have gone together so that you had unified responsibility, that the division of responsibility very often leads to buck passing and bad decision making. Your question on infrastructure is such a valid one, that we have had problems with infrastructure in recent decades in my own area, the electrification of the Great Western Line. That was all going steaming ahead until, as it were, good railway analogy, until they suddenly discovered that going through Bath to Bristol was too difficult, and they're going to have it sort of stop at Chippenham and restart again, electrification at Bristol, and that means you've got to have dual fuel trains, and it's all been a complete muddle and run massively over budget. And so I think there is a real issue. Now, this is where we're supposed to have a Rolls-Royce civil service who's meant to be good at doing these sorts of things. I think you've got to look at whether we do have as Rolls-Royce a civil service as you might hope for.
Is that what's nobbled the Isambard Kingdom Brunel spirit? Is it just too much kind of dead weight?
You say the good news on Heathrow. I'm all for Heathrow. It's terrific. I've always been in favour of having another runway there, another 2 runways, as many runways as we need. We need the airport capacity, and possibly at Gatwick as well, because I'm in favour of competition. But you say the decision's been made, but will it happen in our lifetimes? I mean, the delays in getting things done. There's a very good article about this in the Telegraph, actually, saying, why can't we simply get things done? The Great Western Railway was built in, 4 or 5 years, with the amazing Box Tunnel being done, an absolute feat of engineering, and we need to have a great ability to push ahead with things, and once the decision has been made, to crack on with it. I'm not, as it happens, in favour of HS2. I think it'll be a white elephant by the time it's built. But all these billions of pounds for something that won't happen until 2035, isn't it?
Yes.
And what are we thinking about?
At least.
The legislation has been passed. Why aren't the bulldozers going, if that's what you want to do?
Is it cultural or is it structural? Is there something wrong? Is it just something a question of our status capacity, or is it a cultural ninnying of kind of British attitude?
Well, we used to be able to get things done. We used to be very good at pushing ahead with them. Not all things. Some public projects have always been difficult. If you look at the rebuilding of the House of Parliament after the fire, A, it took a very long time, and B, you had endless disagreements between the House of Lords and the House of Commons as to how it should be done and so on. But we were very good at the big infrastructure projects. And I think that was partly determination, it was partly willpower, and perhaps a willingness of politicians to make the big decisions and be held accountable for them, to see them happen within their period of office.
Something that perhaps Danny Dyer would recommend in our politicians. So perhaps determination, willpower and a willingness to make the decisions might yet crop up at Chequers later this week.
It'll be very interesting to see what happens at Chequers, but the key is that the government does what it said it would do. That's what people expect, that's what 17.4 million people voted for.
Jacob Rees Mogg, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees Mogg about the topics of the day.